Hi guys, it's Rich Hughes here with Rich Hughes Photography. Thought I would put together a little tutorial on exposure. Exposure is very important. If you have gone out and spent a lot of money purchasing a high-end DSLR camera, but you are shooting in auto mode, I'm going to show you how to get out of auto and put it into manual. So today we are going to talk about the 3 pillars of exposure. Now this goes for any and all cameras, but your DSLR being packed full of features and the ability to manually manipulate all of these allows you for a much greater control over the outcome of the image. So we're going to talk about exposure. We're going to talk about each one of these things: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and how it can get you some amazing results just by simply switching that dial from that green auto aggravating setting that's going to tell your camera to just do what you want, make it look how you want, and go from that to putting it into manual. You set the ISO, you set your depth of field, and you set your shutter speed, and get the results that you are looking for. Alright, so we're going to talk about what is exposure. Exposure has been confused, I think, a lot. And basically all exposure is the amount of light that is allowed into your camera to reach the sensor or film, whatever medium that you're using. In this case, we're talking about sensors. So it's the amount of light that is allowed to enter your camera and enter the sensor, and as determined by the 3 things that you see here: your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So inside your camera is a light meter, and you probably notice it's a little dashed lines that go from left to right, and it basically is showing you what the camera thinks is the correct exposure for the light source that you're metering for. Now, right at the center, at 0, is what it thinks is correct. It thinks that is the right amount of light for that scene. So, knowing that, you can look at your light meter and make, a somewhat educated judgment call based on what you were exposing for. This is not always, though, the look that you were going for. You may not want to have, say for example, you're shooting a scene of a, let's just say a landscape, because that's one of my favorite things to shoot. So you're shooting for a landscape, and you have an amazing sunset going on in the background. Now, obviously, the sky is going to be much brighter than the foreground, and things directly in front of you. But you want to expose for that light. You want to expose for the light in the sky. So, how do I do that? You need to understand these 3 things in order to properly expose for what it is you want to come out in that image. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to talk about in the exposure triangle, as they call it, is ISO. ISO is basically the amount of sensitivity or how sensitive your sensor in your camera is to light. And you have control of exactly how sensitive you want that to be. The lower the number, the lower the sensitivity. The higher the number, the higher the sensitivity. but you start to introduce noise and grain into the image, the higher you get as you add ISO to make it more sensitive to light. As you can see here in this first example, you know, at ISO 100 you're pretty crystal clear. There's no grain or noise whatsoever, and as it progresses it gets a lot noisier. In the second example is another good example. The image on the right is shot at ISO 100 and it's very clear in focus. You know, you're not seeing any grain. And the image on the left, shot at ISO 1600, which isn't really that high. I mean, it is a high ISO, but you can still control that in post-process. You can actually remove that grain to a degree. But the higher you get, and the more sensitive that sensor is, the more noise it puts in there, and the harder it is to clean that up. Sometimes you may not want to clean it up. Sometimes it's a look you may be going for, but a lot of the times it's just not. You know, it doesn't look good in your image. So we're going to move on to the next example, and this is a lot bigger breakdown of kind of, you can see a lot better how you slowly but surely start to introduce more and more grain. But if you really look closely, you're really not starting to get really bad until you start getting above ISO 1600. Once you start getting above that range, that's when you can really see things start to get cloudy, fuzzy, and grainy. So that is basically what ISO is. It allows more light into your camera, or you know, basically allows the sensor to be more sensitive to light, more specifically. But the trade-off is that you're going to introduce these, you know, this abnormality or grain and noise into your image. Okay, now let's talk about aperture. This is probably my favorite aspect of photography. It allows you so much creativity when it comes to your images. I always compare it, and it has been compared frequently, to the human eye. So they work a lot similarly. If you were to do a quick thought experiment with me, just with your eyes wide open, just find an object in the room and just focus on that object. If you notice, everything else except for the object that you are focusing on, everything else begins to blur out. That is basically the premise behind using aperture creatively. Sometimes you want everything in focus, and in that case you would want to close down the aperture of your lens. If you close it down, you're going to get much more in focus, but you're going to allow in a lot less light. And the opposite, if you open that aperture all the way up, you're going to get a lot of light in, but it's going to allow you to focus on one area and blur out so much more. And I just really like using it as far as, you know, creatively. Sometimes, you know, you just want one little section of something in focus. You know, then you're getting into like macro photography and things like that. I really don't have a lot of experience, or you know, haven't done any real macro photography, but I love looking at it. Here's a good example. If you notice, it looks as though somebody's focusing pretty much on the red numbers in each one of these. All of the settings are the same, except the aperture is changing. At f16, almost, you know, a great deal of the ruler is in focus, but as we move down the scale and open the aperture up larger and larger, less and less and less of it is in focus. And here's another example, just by simply changing the aperture. The lower the number here, the wider open your aperture is, and the higher the number, the smaller it is. That can be a little confusing, but it just takes a little time to get used to that. But you can see here how much everything is blurred at 2.8, but once you get up to f22, you can see all the way back to the fence. It's a great tool. And here's another way to adjust some blur in motion. I mean, not motion blur, but background blur. Simply by moving your body, moving closer to the subject, will increase the amount of blur in the background. Here you can see all of the settings are exactly the same. The only thing that's changing is how far he is away from the subject with the camera. Alright, last but not least, we're going to talk about shutter speed. The basic rule here is the more blur of motion that you want, the slower the shutter speed. So in this example with the fan, if you slow the shutter speed down to what is that, 100.167 of a second, you will get a lot of motion blur. And as you decrease the amount of time that the shutter is open, the faster it opens and closes, you get closer to freeze framing the motion. And that is the basic concept of that. Again, with all of these settings, you're simply changing the amount of light that is coming into the camera. Here's another good example. At 1/2000th of a second, you can almost see every individual spark flying off of that grinding wheel. But at 1/8 of a second, you're getting these really cool streaming streaks of light. Now, from an artistic standpoint, that might be more of what you're looking for. So knowing what shutter speed to use, or knowing how to change your shutter speed and what it's going to do, helps a lot. Now here you got a cool scene. The bus is streaking by, probably a much slower shutter speed, but the phone booth and all the stationary objects are in focus, and you've got the motion blur from the bus. Very cool effect, and one of the very cool things you can do just by changing your shutter speed. So I hope so far that this information has been helpful. Okay, so now you're probably asking yourself, well, okay, I've watched this whole video and now I understand what each one of these things are, but what now? What do I do with all that information? Well, I'm going to explain that as well. I'm not going to leave you hanging. It's not overly complicated, but again, sometimes this stuff can be a little intimidating. It's basically what I'm going to suggest that you do is, and I know I told you to take your camera out of auto and put it in manual. I'm going to tell you to do just the opposite for this example. When you go to take your next photograph, go ahead, put it in automatic, put it in auto, depress your shutter halfway on what you want to focus on, or use your back button focus. Focus on the object, and I want you to take note of what the settings are on that particular object that you've focused on. Maybe even write them down. Now I want you to take it out of auto and put it back in manual. I want you to think about what you want out of that shot. If your settings are where they are, but you don't like the you're looking at an object that may be moving, right? And you want that object to be frozen in time. Maybe it's a hummingbird. So you want like 1/2000th of a second, but your current settings that is in auto is telling you, 1/500th of a second. Well, I want you to go ahead and I want you to change that setting to the setting that you want, to 1/2000th of a setting. And I want you to look at how many stops of light you have moved that setting. In that case, that's 1/500th to 1/1000th, and then generally to 1/2000th of a second if you're jumping whole stops of light. Some let you jump in at thirds of a stop, but think in stops of light, single whole stops of light. So every time you move a stop, one stop is doubling the amount of light, or cutting it in half if you're going the other way. So if you've moved that from 1/500th of a second to 1/2000th of a second, that is 2 whole stops of light. So if you have decreased the amount of light that you have got coming into this image by 2 whole stops of light, then you know that just simply by adjusting one of the other 2 legs of the exposure triangle by 1 stop each, or by 2 stops on one of those legs, you can get the effect you're looking for. So if you've moved 2 stops of light on your shutter speed to get the effect that you want, all you have to do is move 2 stops of light on your ISO or on your aperture, and you're going to get the exact same exposure. And this works for all 3. So if you're wanting to shoot something at a low ISO, but it wants you to expose for a whole minute or 30 seconds to get that, you can change your aperture in order to allow more light in to adjust for that. So just count your stops of light and start getting used to counting all of those stops and paying attention to how many you take away and how many you add, and simply add it back or take it away from one of the other settings. I hope this has helped. I hope somebody learns something from this. It sets off a light bulb in their head so that you can start creating better content and creating better photographs and video. If you like the video, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and we'll see you next time.